I'm Greg Remke. I work with economic thinking. We do workshops on the economics of debate topics. Here is part two of an introductory presentation on the economics of European Union immigration reform. This is the policy being considered by the NCFCA debate league. So in the first presentation, I went through a number of different issues relevant to immigration reform, and you can look at that on YouTube. Here I wanted to just mention a few more things. One of the reasons that immigration tends to be economically beneficial to a wealthy developed countries like the European Union or the United States is that the profile of people in the country, the economic profile, is different from the profile of immigrants. So in the US or EU, we tend to have fewer people with engineering degrees, PhDs in the sciences, fewer scientists. And we also have very few at the bottom levels without a high school education, without local language skills. And so the profile is sort of like an egg or a diamond. Now, this isn't to say that people with the fewer skills are worse people or not as worthy. It's simply that they lack the human capital investments that allow them to prosper as much in the marketplace, but they're beneficial for an economy. You need people, to clean hospitals, to be janitors, to do roofing, to do all sorts of work. All work has a value in and of itself. And people, young people especially, start without job skills but gain them over time. Immigrants, however, tend to have a different profile. This is partly because immigration policy restricts immigration in various ways. So we let in agricultural workers to help with farms. We also let in scientists and engineers, graduate students at universities. So the immigration profile for the US and the EU tends to be more of an hourglass shape with lots more at the top, lots more at the bottom, and not as many in the middle. So immigrants, many scientists and engineers in the U.S., like 50% of the graduate school engineers are immigrants from other countries, graduate students. And also the people who come in from, Latin American countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and elsewhere tend to have less education, lack English language skills, or those who come in from Middle East, North Africa tend to lack the language skills as they come into Europe. So as you allow more immigration, these two sort of merge and complement each other. This is why there's so much economic benefit in countries like Germany and United Kingdom that have allowed larger scale immigration compared to other countries. There's a combination of skills with immigration. So one of the benefits. I've written a lot, posted a lot on economicthinking.org on immigration issues. You can look there for more. Another area to look at when we look at migration from poor countries to wealthy countries, whether from Turkey, Syria, North Africa to Europe, or Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala to the US, the question is, why are these people migrating? Why are the countries that they're from so poor compared to the countries they're going to? I mean, it makes sense. People want opportunity in wealthier countries, but why are countries poor in the first place? So people say, well, it's past colonialism or past Cold War proxy wars or imperialism or North-South inequality from capitalism, where wealthy corporations are grabbing resources from Africa or from Central America and bringing those to the West. Like coffee beans are sold very cheaply, or sugar very cheaply in sub-Saharan Africa, and yet when they get to Belgium, they're made into chocolate and sold for a lot, or Starbucks sells them for a lot. So maybe there's a fundamental inequality in the way the capitalist system works, and this is one of the criticisms. I'm afraid the link is not all on the page there. I'll try and fix that. So a book about this subject is about invisible wealth, and this draws from focus on institutional issues. The World Bank and others have discussed this, but the issue here is natural capital. If you were to look at the sum of croplands, pasture lands, forested areas, the things we often think of as wealth, non-renewable resources like oil and natural gas, these are estimated to be just 5% of a wealth of a country, so not very much. The produced capital, the machinery, the equipment, infrastructure, the factories, we think of that as a big deal in, why America is wealthy or Germany is wealthy compared to countries in Africa or Central America. But a World Bank study estimates that's only 18% of the wealth of the country has. The other 77%, the vast majority, is what's called intangible capital. And this includes the population's knowledge and skills, the level of trust in a society, and most importantly, the quality of its institutions. How easy is it to get a license to open a business? How easy is it to get title to your house or to get a bank loan on the value of your house to start a company? How easy is it to enter the monetary system and get a bank account? These institutions are what wealthy countries have and poor countries don't. So it's not so much a question of who's got the raw materials or the oil or the natural gas or who's got the factories and highways. Those are important, but the biggest thing are the institutions that are a core part of society. And many economists have focused on this, and we'll have more links in upcoming articles and videos. So that's part of the story there, and I'm trying to move on. So we have the question of what causes economic growth, and this is particularly relevant to the issue of EU immigration. Turns out a big part of the European Union's wealth is related to immigration. As I mentioned in the last presentation, looking at the immigration into Germany and how that's added to its dynamism. But all of European history is a parade of migration from one place to another. The various diaspora, the Armenians, the Chinese, Huguenots, Jews being forced out of their countries. These were poor immigrants into Europe who developed Western Europe, and many from Western Europe then came to the United States, Latin America, Argentina particularly, and Australia, Canada, and brought wealth to those. These people left because of violence in their home countries, wars, but also politics and regulations. So what this article and the link here is to this, it just looks at the history of gifted and energetic people moving to Holland in particular, and then to other countries. So if you look at European economic history, you find sort of amazingly it wasn't the French that were the most wealthy country in the 1600s, or the Spanish that stole all the gold from the New World. Economic prosperity in Europe comes in the 1700s from the Dutch and the English, who, what is it that, what allowed the Dutch to be so prosperous? Well, it turned out the Dutch was a first European republic, tolerant toward religion, and also tolerant toward immigrants. So people came from all over the world into Holland to do business. The Pilgrims, for example, went there from England before they came to the New World, and their experience with markets and commerce was important for their background for coming to America. It's misleading to say the Dutch did it. It was the openness that attracted so many people to Amsterdam. Similarly, I mentioned the West German miracle was mostly from economic reforms and migration. So just a final note, in the background of all this, one of the key things to understand from the 1990s to the 2020s, we've had a vast improvement in economic freedom and a reduction in global poverty. As I record this in late April 2020, we're in the middle of the pandemic and the lockdowns that are hurting people and killing people in Europe, in the United States, and around the world. But that's going to end. We're going to recover from that, and we're going to continue this path that has been so astonishing in the last, just starting from 1990. You have a reduction of over 1 billion people living in poverty, but abject poverty, that is under $2 a day. At the same time, the world population increased by a couple billion. So just as a background in this, we want to ask why. So if we want to reduce illegal immigration from Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa to Europe, or if we want to help humanitarian aid in Sub-Saharan Africa, or development aid in El Salvador, Guatemala, in Honduras, we should try to learn from the lessons of the economic freedom reforms that brought so much prosperity to China, to Southeast Asia, to India, as well as to Eastern Europe. The fall of communism at the end of the 1980s was crucial to opening up much of the world economy to international trade, international investment, and international migration. So various sources on this. I would argue that this economic freedom background issue is critical for all of the NCFCA topics, proposed topics. Also, a big issue for the Central American topic are the refugee caravans that come to the southern borders and create economic turmoil in the U.S. as the Trump administration tries to block it. You've got both labor unions and the Obama administration and the Trump administration dramatically trying to reduce immigration, refugees, and labor migration into the U.S. And all over the world are millions of people that are escaping war and poverty and violence in their country, but they can't get into the wealthy countries. I mean, some do legally and illegally. Many die trying to get from Africa across the Caribbean, but millions are stuck in refugee camps from warfare in Syria, from trouble across the Middle East, North Africa region. There are millions in refugee camps that are stuck there for years, for decades. How do we solve that problem? There's a number of fascinating proposals that we'll talk about, particularly with Honduras and charter cities and others. But one is to look at these refugee camps in general and to compare and contrast and to consider that the most prosperous places in the world, places like Hong Kong, were essentially refugee camps in the 1950s. Opening to millions coming in, impoverished, escaping communist China. How did they get from poverty to prosperity in a generation or two? And economists say it's economic freedom. We could do the same in refugee camps around the world. We could have, refugee cities or startup cities. Uganda is one of the examples, and this study looks at what happens at a refugee camp where people are allowed to work, to start businesses, to engage with their native or natural entrepreneurial skills. That would be one way to address concerns about illegal immigration coming into Europe, as well as immigration coming in caravans from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. So you can look at these myths about refugees. It's a fascinating background, again, relevant. I have articles on this on the economic thinking site. Also, for the EU topic, we also have a Lincoln Douglas proposed topic on the rights. Is there a right to immigrate, a right to move? And Chandran here is giving a presentation for Mercatus. He's written a couple books. He's now, he was at Oxford, I believe. He argues that, if you're going to control immigration, that means you're controlling everybody, right? Because if you have to prove you're not an illegal immigrant, you have to have papers and prove you're a citizen. And the control of immigration means the control of citizens. And this is a challenge in the United States, a challenge in the European Union, and it's discussed in his presentation. It's a danger to freedom to control immigration. Now, again, we want to stop terrorists. We want to stop people with infectious diseases. We want to stop criminals. But that's not the same as stopping people who just want to come to work, labor mobility, and so forth. Controlling outsiders is a danger to controlling insiders. Immigration is about the control of citizens and residents in order to prove that they're not, illegal immigrants. So one of the benefits of having an equality of freedom that allows people to move legally from place to place, as it was, before World War I, means that you have less controls on everyday people. So what kind of legal reforms could there be? Well, for the United States, the Kriebel Foundation has the red card solution, and something like this can easily apply to the European Union. That is, if you're in Africa or Middle East or Syria and you want to work for a company in Europe, you go to an employment agency and apply for a work visa. The employment company checks you to make sure you're not a terrorist, make sure you're not, you don't have tuberculosis or coronavirus, you're not a criminal, and then you are hired by a company, you're insured, You get let's say a 5-year work visa, it's renewable, and then you don't have the problem of illegality. The factories in Germany can hire workers, and you don't have the people dying trying to come by boat into southern Europe. You can also have startup visas. There are huge numbers of entrepreneurs in Egypt and other countries in Middle East, North Africa, and Africa who'd like to start a business in EU. Well, could they get a startup visa? They get investors, a startup visa, and then they hire local people and build their company. And that's the reality. Silicon Valley is full of people who have come from other countries to start companies here, hire U.S. workers, hire other workers. So there's a book, Startup Visas, about this. Canada has a point system and startup visas. They have privately sponsored refugees. One way, instead of having a huge expensive refugee program in the US and in Europe, you have churches and nonprofits sponsor refugees. That is, they agree to take care of them, to indemnify any damage they might do, and then they can come and work, and they're not a problem for everyday people. And so this is, if you have a problem getting an H-1B into the U.S., go to Canada. Similarly, people that can't get into the EU would go to Canada. This benefits Canada, benefits the people. So the challenge that economists look at is people seem to think that immigrants lower wage rates or hurt people, hurt the average American worker. This is misleading in a whole bunch of ways, according to the economic data on this. It's worth investigating those claims, but by and large, the benefits are huge. So, relevant stories from other places. And I talked, whoops, that slide's messed up. Well, let's stop for now, and we'll come back, and maybe there'll be more later. Thank you very much.